A young girl's simple act of kindness sparks a ripple effect that could change her family's future forever. But with whispers, suspicion, and a mysterious black car following her, is this a blessing or a dangerous risk? Stay tuned to find out. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The rain pounded relentlessly against the cracked windows of a small, dimly lit apartment complex on the east side of Detroit, Michigan. Streets flooded quickly, turning the already battered neighborhood into a scene of despair. Amara Johnson, a 14-year-old girl with deep brown eyes and tight black curls, pulled the hood of her oversized jacket tighter around her face. The rain soaked through her thin sneakers as she hurriedly moved along the sidewalk, her hands clutching a plastic bag filled with empty bottles and cans. Amara's life was a quiet rhythm of struggle and resilience. As the eldest of 3 siblings, she carried the weight of responsibilities far beyond her years. Her father had died in a construction accident 3 years ago, leaving her mother, Miss Lillian, to care for the family. Miss Lillian worked grueling hours as a janitor at a local office building, and even with her dedication, the bills piled up faster than she could manage. The rain didn't deter Amara's mission. She scoured the streets around a corner store, picking up discarded bottles and cans. The faint neon glow of the store's sign reflected on the puddles at her feet. She felt the stares of passers-by, some curious, others judgmental. A group of teenagers loitering near the entrance whispered loudly as she passed, their laughter slicing through the patter of rain. "Don't mind them," she whispered to herself, her breath fogging in the chilly air. "You're doing this for a reason." Amara ducked behind the store, into an alley, where the store owner, Mr. Patel, often threw out recyclables. The man had always watched her with a wary eye, as if she might snatch something that didn't belong to her. Today was no different. Amara glanced toward the store window and saw Mr. Patel's silhouette, his arms crossed as he stared out into the rain. "Just a few more cans," Amara muttered, ignoring the tightness in her chest. She knew people's opinions didn't pay the electric bill. After collecting enough to trade for a few dollars, Amara headed home. The rain had eased to a drizzle by the time she reached the dilapidated brick apartment building. Its narrow hallways smelled of mildew and faint cooking spices. She pushed open the creaky door to their 2-room apartment, water dripping from her jacket. "Amara, is that you?" her mother called from the kitchen, her voice heavy with fatigue. "Yeah, Ma, I'm home," Amara answered, setting the bag of cans down near the door. She removed her wet sneakers and stepped into the warmth of the small living room. The apartment was as worn as the rest of the building. The ceiling leaked from multiple places, and buckets were strategically placed to catch the dripping water. An old space heater hummed in the corner, barely keeping the chill at bay. On the small kitchen table lay a stack of unopened envelopes. Bills? All of them. Miss Lillian stood at the stove, stirring a pot of canned soup. Her shoulders slumped, her uniform stained and wrinkled from the long shift she had just completed. Amara's 6-year-old brother, Darius, lay curled under a blanket on the worn couch, coughing softly in his sleep. Amara walked to her mother, pulling a handful of damp dollar bills from her pocket. "I got a little bit more today, Ma," she said, her voice low but hopeful. Miss Lillian turned to her daughter, her eyes softening despite the exhaustion etched into her face. She gently took the money and placed it on the counter. "Thank you, baby," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every little bit helps." Amara leaned against the counter, watching her mother. She could see the strain in every movement, the weight of too many sacrifices. "How's Darius?" Amara asked. Miss Lillian sighed, turning back to the pot of soup. "Still coughing. I'll try to get him to the clinic this weekend if I can find the time." Amara nodded, her heart heavy. She glanced around the room, taking in the peeling wallpaper and the sagging couch. She wished for something better, not just for herself, but for her family. A place where her mother didn't have to work herself to the bone, where Darius didn't have to sleep wrapped in blankets to stay warm, and where they didn't have to rely on spare change to survive. Later that night, Amara lay in her small bed, listening to the sound of rain dripping into the buckets around the apartment. The dim light of a street lamp outside her window cast shadows on the ceiling. She stared at the cracks above her, imagining them closing up, imagining a roof that didn't leak, walls that didn't crumble. Her thoughts drifted to school, to the whispers of classmates and the teacher's pitying looks. She had dreams. Dreams of getting out of Detroit, going to college, and building a life where her family didn't have to struggle anymore. But those dreams felt distant, like the faint glimmer of the stars hidden behind the clouds. "Tomorrow's another day," she whispered to herself, closing her eyes against the ache in her chest. "Just keep going, Amara, one step at a time." The sun barely peeked through the thick clouds the next morning as Amara hurried home from school. Her backpack, heavy with books and the weight of expectations, hung loosely over her shoulders. The air was damp and cold, but she moved quickly, her eyes scanning the ground out of habit for anything she could collect. Cans, bottles, scrap metal, anything that might add a few dollars to their tight budget. Turning the corner toward the small market near her apartment, she noticed an elderly man struggling with several large grocery bags. His stooped frame and unsteady gait caught her attention. The man paused near the curb, shifting the weight of his bags, but his frail hands couldn't keep up with the load. Amara slowed her steps, watching as one of the bags slipped from his grip, spilling its contents onto the wet sidewalk. Oranges rolled in every direction, a loaf of bread tumbled out, and a can of soup rattled toward the gutter. She glanced around. A few passers-by walked on without a second thought. Some turned their heads away, pretending not to see. Amara hesitated. She knew how people in the neighborhood tended to look at her, with suspicion, like she was up to no good. "Do something, Amara," she whispered to herself. Taking a deep breath, she jogged over to the man, dropping her backpack to the ground. "Excuse me, sir," she said, kneeling to gather the oranges. "Let me help you." The man looked down at her, his face lined with years of experience and hardship. His gray eyebrows knitted together in confusion at first, then softened. "Oh, thank you," he said, his voice trembling. He clutched the remaining bags tightly as if afraid she might run off with them. Amara worked quickly, scooping up the groceries and placing them back in the torn paper bag. She stood, holding it out to him. "Here you go," she said, her voice steady but kind. "You sure you don't need a hand carrying the rest?" The man hesitated, his dark brown eyes studying her carefully. There was a flicker of doubt, but it gave way to something else. Gratitude. "I can manage," he said after a moment, taking the bag from her hands. "But thank you, young lady. It's rare to find someone willing to stop and help these days." Amara nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest despite the cold air. "No problem," she said. "Take care of yourself." As she turned to pick up her backpack, the man called after her. "Wait." She turned, her eyebrows raised. "What's your name?" he asked. "Amara," she replied. "Amara Johnson." The man gave her a small smile, his wrinkles deepening around his eyes. "Well, Amara, sometimes it's the smallest acts of kindness that change everything. You'll see." She tilted her head, not quite sure what he meant, but before she could ask, he turned and shuffled away, his slow steps fading into the noise of the street. As Amara bent to grab her backpack, she felt a prickle of unease. She glanced across the street and noticed a sleek black car parked near the curb. The windows were tinted, but the faint silhouette of a man sitting inside was unmistakable. He appeared to be watching her. Amara frowned, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. The man didn't move, and the car remained eerily still. She tried to shake off the uneasiness as she turned and walked home, but the image of the car lingered in her mind. By the time Amara arrived home, the memory of the old man and the strange car had been pushed to the back of her mind. She stepped inside the apartment, where the faint smell of soup and onions greeted her. "How was school?" her mother asked, her back turned as she stirred a pot on the stove. "Fine," Amara said, kicking off her shoes. She dropped her backpack by the couch and sat beside Darius, who was wrapped in a blanket, drawing a stick figure family on a scrap piece of paper. "You get anything extra today?" Miss Lillian asked, without turning around. Amara hesitated. "No, Ma, just school and back." Her mother nodded, her shoulders sagging. "Well, dinner's almost ready. Make sure Darius washes his hands." Amara glanced at her little brother, who was now holding his drawing up for her to see. "Look, Amara, it's us," he said, beaming with pride. She smiled and ruffled his curls. "That's beautiful, Darius. You're an artist in the making." That night, as the family settled in for the evening, Amara found herself staring at the ceiling again. The sound of dripping water from the leaky roof filled the room. She thought about the old man and his words. Sometimes it's the smallest acts of kindness that change everything. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something she couldn't quite name. And then there was the car, the man who had been watching her. Who was he? And why was he there? As sleep finally claimed her, Amara whispered to herself, one step at a time. Outside, under the dim glow of a street lamp, the black car remained parked for a few moments longer before quietly pulling away into the night. The morning sunlight crept through the thin curtains of the Johnson family's apartment, bathing the cramped living room in a muted glow. Amara sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring a bowl of cereal, as Darius colored happily next to her. Miss Lillian bustled about, folding laundry and packing her lunch for another long shift at work. "Eat up, Amara," Miss Lillian said, glancing at her daughter. "You're going to need your energy today." Amara smiled faintly and nodded, though her mind lingered on the old man she had helped the day before. His words replayed in her mind. Sometimes it's the smallest acts of kindness that change everything. She wondered if he had made it home safely, hoping that her small gesture had made even a tiny difference in his day. Just as she was about to finish her cereal, a sharp knock at the door shattered the quiet. The sound startled everyone in the room. Miss Lillian froze, her brow furrowing. Visitors were rare in their part of Detroit, and unexpected ones usually brought trouble. "I'll get it, Ma," Amara said quickly, rising from her seat. She opened the door cautiously, peeking out before swinging it fully open. Standing there was a man she had never seen before, middle-aged, tall, and sharply dressed in a tailored gray suit. His polished shoes gleamed against the cracked concrete of the hallway floor, and his demeanor exuded an air of authority. "Good morning," the man said with a polite smile, his deep voice calm but deliberate. "Is this the Johnson residence?" Amara's heart skipped a beat. She tightened her grip on the doorframe. "Yeah, who's asking?" The man inclined his head slightly. "My name is Andrew Kane. I represent Mr. Wilson. May I come in? I'd like to speak with you and your family." Miss Lillian appeared behind Amara, her expression wary. "What's this about, Mr. Kane?" she asked, her tone firm but not unkind. Mr. Kane's smile softened. "I assure you, ma'am, this isn't about any trouble. Mr. Wilson asked me to extend his gratitude to your daughter. He was deeply moved by her kindness yesterday. He wanted to express his thanks in person, but he's not in the best health to do so." Amara stepped aside reluctantly, glancing at her mother for guidance. Miss Lillian hesitated for a moment before nodding and gesturing toward the small living room. "Come in," she said cautiously, "but we don't have much time. I need to get to work." Mr. Kane stepped inside, his presence seeming to fill the cramped space. He glanced around briefly, taking in the worn furniture, the stack of unopened bills on the counter, and the makeshift buckets catching water from the ceiling. His expression remained composed, though there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Thank you for letting me in," he began, taking a seat on the edge of the couch. "As I mentioned, Mr. Wilson was incredibly touched by what Amara did for him yesterday. He said it wasn't just the help, it was the way she treated him, with respect and compassion. It's something he hasn't experienced in a long time." Miss Lillian crossed her arms, her skepticism evident. "She did what anyone would have done," she said plainly. "We don't need thanks for that." Mr. Kane shook his head. "With all due respect, not everyone would have stopped. Mr. Wilson knows that. He wanted to do something meaningful to show his appreciation." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out an envelope, placing it carefully on the coffee table. "This is a small gesture from Mr. Wilson, a way to help your family with some of the immediate challenges you might be facing. The amount should cover any outstanding bills and provide a little breathing room." Amara's eyes widened, and she glanced at her mother, who stood frozen, staring at the envelope as if it might bite. Miss Lillian's voice was sharp when she spoke. "We don't take handouts, Mr. Kane." Mr. Kane raised his hands in a gesture of reassurance. "This isn't charity, ma'am. It's gratitude. Mr. Wilson has been fortunate in his life, and he believes in paying kindness forward. He sees potential in Amara and wants to support her in any way he can." The room grew quiet. Amara could feel her mother's internal battle, pride clashing against the undeniable need for help. The weight of the bills, the leaky roof, and Darius's persistent cough hung heavy in the air. Finally, Miss Lillian spoke, her voice steady, but laced with tension. "Thank you, Mr. Kane, but we've managed this far on our own. I won't teach my children to expect things from strangers." Amara's heart sank. She understood her mother's pride, but she couldn't help but think of how much the money could ease their burden. Mr. Kane nodded, respecting her decision. He stood, adjusting his suit jacket. "I understand, Mrs. Johnson. If you change your mind, please don't hesitate to reach out. My card is in the envelope." He paused, looking directly at Amara. "And Amara, I want you to know, you made a difference yesterday. Mr. Wilson isn't the only one who noticed." Amara blinked, confused by his words, but before she could ask what he meant, Mr. Kane nodded politely and made his way to the door. "Thank you for your time. I'll leave you to think it over." The door clicked shut, and silence filled the apartment once again. Amara turned to her mother, who was still staring at the envelope on the table. "Ma," Amara began hesitantly, "maybe we should—" "No," Miss Lillian said firmly, cutting her off. She picked up the envelope and shoved it back into the briefcase. "We don't need this." "But Ma, what if it could help Darius?" Amara argued, her voice tinged with desperation. "You work so hard, and we're still barely getting by." Miss Lillian's face softened, but her voice remained resolute. "Amara, I appreciate what you're trying to say, but there's no such thing as free help. People always expect something in return." Amara sighed, her shoulders slumping. She wanted to believe Mr. Kane's words, that this was just a gesture of gratitude, but her mother's caution weighed heavily on her. That night, as Amara lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Kane's parting words. "You made a difference yesterday. Mr. Wilson isn't the only one who noticed." Who else had noticed? And what did it mean for her family? The morning sun shone weakly over the neighborhood as Amara stepped out of the apartment, her school bag slung over her shoulder. The air was crisp, but the streets buzzed with their usual activity. Neighbors exchanging hushed conversations, shopkeepers opening their stores, and children racing down the sidewalks. Yet, something felt off. Amara noticed the subtle shifts in people's gazes as she passed by. The glances that lingered a little too long, the murmured words just loud enough to be overheard. "She thinks she's too good for this place now," one woman whispered to another as Amara walked by. "Who drives a car like that here?" another man muttered, shaking his head. Amara's heart sank. She didn't have to ask to know they were talking about Mr. Kane's visit the day before. She could feel the weight of their judgment pressing on her shoulders, each word laced with suspicion and disdain. Later that afternoon, Amara stopped by Mr. Patel's corner store to grab a loaf of bread and some milk for her mother. As she entered, the bell above the door jingled, and Mr. Patel glanced up from the register. His usual stern expression hardened when he saw her. "You again," he muttered, barely loud enough for her to hear. Amara ignored the comment and made her way to the back of the store, picking up the items on her list. As she approached the counter to pay, Mr. Patel leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing. "What's going on with you in that fancy car, huh?" he asked, his tone accusatory. Amara froze, the loaf of bread in her hands. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," he said, crossing his arms. "That car yesterday. The man in the suit. What's he doing in this neighborhood visiting your family?" Amara felt her face flush with a mix of embarrassment and anger. "He was just thanking me for helping someone," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. Mr. Patel scoffed. "People like that don't just thank you for nothing. You and your family better not be bringing trouble here." Amara clenched her jaw, gripping the loaf of bread tightly. "We're not, and it's none of your business." She shoved the money onto the counter and grabbed her items, storming out of the store before he could say anything else. Her chest heaved as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the stares of passers-by feeling heavier than ever. Tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. By the time Amara returned to the apartment, her mother was sitting at the small kitchen table, sorting through bills. The room was quiet except for the occasional sound of Darius's pencil scratching against paper as he worked on his school assignment. "Amara, you're late," Miss Lillian said, not looking up. "I stopped by the store," Amara replied, setting the groceries on the counter. She hesitated, debating whether to tell her mother about what had happened with Mr. Patel. Finally, she sat down across from her. "Ma, do you think people hate us?" Miss Lillian frowned, glancing up from the bills. "What kind of question is that?" "People are talking," Amara said quietly, "about Mr. Kane, about the car. They think we're, I don't know, Doing something wrong? Miss Lillian sighed, leaning back in her chair. Her eyes softened, but there was a hint of weariness in her expression. Amara, listen to me. People will always have something to say, especially when they don't understand what's going on. It's easier for them to judge than to ask questions. But it's not fair, Amara said, her voice cracking. We didn't do anything wrong. I know, baby, Miss Lillian said, reaching across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. But we can't control what people think. All we can do is keep doing what's right. Amara nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. She wanted to believe her mother's words, but the whispers and stares were hard to ignore. Over the next few days, the rumors only grew louder. Everywhere Amara went, she felt the weight of people's judgment. Some neighbors openly avoided her family, while others whispered behind their backs. Even her classmates at school began to treat her differently. One afternoon, Amara overheard a group of kids talking as she walked past them in the hallway. Did you hear about Amara? Her family's getting money from some rich guy. Probably did something shady to get it. Amara clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to turn around and yell at them, to tell them they didn't know anything about her or her family. But instead, she kept walking, her head held high, even as her cheeks burned with shame. That evening, Miss Lillian came home looking more exhausted than usual. She dropped her bag by the door and sank into a chair, her shoulders slumped. "What's wrong, Ma?" Amara asked, concerned. Miss Lillian hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Patel said something to me today. About the car. About Mr. Kane." Amara's stomach twisted. "What did he say?" "He implied that we're taking advantage of someone," Miss Lillian said, her voice tight. "That we're doing something dishonest." Amara's anger flared. "That's not true. He doesn't know anything about us." Miss Lillian sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know, Amara, but people don't care about the truth. They see what they want to see." For the first time, Amara saw just how much the rumors were affecting her mother. Miss Lillian had always been strong, holding the family together through every hardship. But now, the weight of people's judgment was taking its toll. "We'll get through this, Ma," Amara said, her voice firm. "We don't need them to believe in us. We just need to believe in ourselves." Miss Lillian looked at her daughter, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. "You're a good girl, Amara. Don't ever forget that." That night, as Amara lay in bed, she replayed her mother's words in her mind. She thought about Mr. Wilson, about Mr. Kane, about the whispers and stares. She couldn't control what people thought, but she could control her actions. And no matter what, she was determined to prove that her family's integrity was unshakable. As sleep finally took her, she whispered into the darkness, one step at a time. The wind carried a biting chill as Amara walked home from school, her thoughts heavy with the weight of the day. The whispers had become louder, the stares more piercing. Even her teachers seemed to regard her differently now, their pitying glances replaced by subtle suspicion. Amara's shoulders ached from the invisible burden she carried, and her steps quickened as she neared the familiarity of home. When she reached the apartment building, she saw him again, Mr. Kane, standing tall and composed in his neatly pressed suit. The black car was parked nearby, gleaming under the pale afternoon sun. Amara froze for a moment, unsure whether to approach or turn away, but Mr. Kane spotted her before she could decide. "Amara," he called, his voice calm yet commanding. "I was hoping to catch you." She sighed and trudged toward him, her school bag slipping from her shoulder. "What are you doing here again, Mr. Kane?" He offered her a polite smile. "I came to speak with your mother. Is she home?" Amara hesitated, glancing up at the apartment window. She could see the faint silhouette of her mother moving about inside. "Yeah, she's home. But why are you here this time?" Mr. Kane's expression softened, though there was a firmness in his gaze. "I have an opportunity I'd like to discuss. Something that could change your family's situation." Minutes later, the three of them sat in the cramped living room, the air thick with tension. Miss Lillian perched on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Amara sat beside her, her backpack forgotten at her feet. Mr. Kane sat across from them in the lone armchair, his briefcase resting neatly on his knees. "I'll get straight to the point," he began, his tone steady. "Mr. Wilson is not just a retired man living quietly in Detroit. He's a philanthropist who believes in giving back to those who deserve it. And he believes your family deserves an opportunity to rise above your circumstances. Miss Lillian stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. We've already said we don't want handouts, Mr. Kane. I understand that, he replied, holding up a hand. This isn't charity. It's an investment in your daughter's future. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a sleek folder, sliding it across the coffee table toward them. This is a scholarship offer for Amara, a full ride to one of the best private schools in the state. Tuition, books, uniforms, everything would be covered. Amara's eyes widened as she stared at the folder, her breath catching in her throat. Scholarship? Mr. Kane nodded. Yes, the school has excellent resources, small class sizes, and a network of alumni that opens doors to some of the best colleges in the country. This isn't just an education. It's a chance to change your life. Miss Lillian didn't reach for the folder. Instead, her gaze hardened as she looked at Mr. Kane. And what's the catch? She asked, her voice sharp. There's no catch, Mr. Kane said evenly. All we ask is that Amara works hard to maintain her grades and participate in the school's community service program. We want her to succeed, not just academically, but as a well-rounded individual. Amara's heart pounded as she listened, her emotions warring within her. The offer was beyond anything she could have imagined. She thought about her cramped classrooms, the outdated textbooks, and the lack of opportunities at her current school. This could be her chance to escape, to build a future for herself and her family. But the tension radiating from her mother was impossible to ignore. Miss Lillian's jaw tightened, and she shook her head. We don't need someone swooping in and telling us what's best for our family. Amara can succeed without going to some fancy private school. Ma, wait, Amara said, her voice trembling. This could be what we need. What I need. Her mother turned to her, her eyes filled with a mix of love and fear. Amara, I've seen offers like this before. They always come with strings attached. What happens if you don't meet their expectations? What happens when they decide they've done enough and leave us with nothing? Mr. Kane leaned forward, his tone measured. Mrs. Johnson, I understand your concerns, but Mr. Wilson's intentions are genuine. He's not asking for anything in return. This is about giving Amara a chance to thrive. Amara looked at her mother, her chest tight. Ma, please, I can do this. I'll work harder than I ever have. I won't let you down. Miss Lillian's eyes softened, but the lines of worry on her face deepened. She looked at Mr. Kane, then back at her daughter. This isn't just about you, Amara. It's about our family. I can't risk putting us in a situation we can't get out of. Maybe this is how we get out, Amara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe this is the break we've been waiting for. For a long moment, the room was silent. Finally, Miss Lillian sighed and rubbed her temples. I need time to think about this, she said, her voice weary. Of course, Mr. Kane said, standing and gathering his things. Take all the time you need. My card is in the folder if you have any questions. As he headed for the door, he paused and turned back to Amara. You have potential, Amara. Don't let fear hold you back. That night, after Darius had gone to bed, Amara and her mother sat in the dimly lit living room. The folder still sat on the coffee table, unopened. Ma, why can't you just trust that this is a good thing? Amara asked, her voice breaking. Why can't you believe that something good might actually happen for us? Miss Lillian sighed heavily. It's not that I don't believe in good things, Amara. I just know how quickly they can be taken away. But we have to try, Amara said, her eyes pleading. I want to give you and Darius a better life. Isn't that what Dad would have wanted? Miss Lillian's face crumpled at the mention of her late husband. She looked away, tears glistening in her eyes. Your father always said to protect our dignity above all else. And maybe this is how we protect it, Amara argued softly, by proving that we're more than what people think we are. Miss Lillian didn't respond. She simply reached out and pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, holding her as if she were afraid to let go. The evening sky darkened ominously as thick gray clouds gathered over the neighborhood. Amara sat by the window, her chin resting on her knees, watching the wind pick up. Trash and loose paper swirled along the cracked pavement outside, and the air felt electric. heavy with the promise of an approaching storm. Rain lashed against the windows, the sound of the wind howling through the cracks in the building. Water began to drip from the ceiling, collecting in the usual buckets scattered around the apartment. Darius huddled on the couch under a blanket, his wide eyes watching the shadows cast by the flickering light bulb. "Ma, the water's getting worse," Amara said, pointing to a new leak forming above the kitchen. Miss Lillian grabbed another pot and placed it under the dripping water. "We'll deal with it," she said, her voice tight with frustration. But the storm was relentless. The power flickered once, then twice, before plunging the apartment into darkness. Darius whimpered, clutching his blanket tighter. "It's okay, baby," Miss Lillian said, lighting a small candle and placing it on the table. "It's just the storm. We'll be fine." But Amara could hear the uncertainty in her mother's voice. The wind outside sounded like it was trying to tear the building apart, and she could feel the cold seeping through the thin walls. She pulled Darius close, wrapping an arm around him as he buried his face in her side. Hours passed, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. The water dripping from the ceiling had turned into steady streams, soaking the floors despite their efforts to contain it. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the building, followed by the sound of rushing water. "What was that?" Amara asked, her heart pounding. Miss Lillian ran to the window and gasped. "The basement's flooded! It's coming up through the floors!" Before they could react, water began seeping through the edges of the apartment, pooling at their feet. Darius cried out in fear, and Amara scooped him up, holding him close. "We have to get out of here," Miss Lillian said urgently, grabbing her coat. "Put on your shoes, Amara. We're leaving now." Amara nodded, her hands shaking as she helped Darius into his coat and boots. The water rose quickly, soaking their shoes as they waded through the apartment. Miss Lillian grabbed a small bag with essentials before opening the door, where the hallway was already ankle-deep in water. Outside, the storm raged on, the rain pounding down so hard it felt like needles against their skin. The three of them huddled together as they navigated the flooded streets, searching for a safe place to go. "Where can we go, Ma?" Amara shouted over the wind. Miss Lillian didn't answer immediately, her eyes scanning the street. Finally, she spotted the faint glow of headlights in the distance. A black car, sleek and familiar, approached slowly through the waterlogged road. Amara's stomach sank as the car pulled up beside them. The window rolled down, revealing Mr. Kane in the driver's seat. His usually composed expression was tinged with concern. "Get in," he said firmly, opening the passenger door. Miss Lillian hesitated, her jaw tightening. She looked at Amara, then at Darius, who was shivering against his sister's chest. Finally, she sighed and nodded, ushering them into the car. The interior was warm, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Darius clung to Amara, his small frame trembling as the car moved through the flooded streets. "I heard about the storm," Mr. Kane said as he drove. "I thought you might need help." "We didn't ask for it," Miss Lillian replied sharply, though her voice lacked its usual strength. "No, you didn't," Mr. Kane said, his tone calm. "But that doesn't mean you don't deserve it." Mr. Kane brought them to a nearby hotel, where he had already arranged for a room. The warm, dry space felt like a miracle after the cold and wet chaos of the night. Miss Lillian stood stiffly by the door as Mr. Kane handed her the key card. "You don't owe me anything," he said gently. "This is just a place for you to rest until the storm passes." Miss Lillian looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "Why are you doing this? What do you really want?" Mr. Kane met her gaze, his expression earnest. "I want to help. That's all." She didn't respond, but she took the key card and led her children inside. As the family settled into the hotel room, Amara watched her mother from the corner of her eye. Miss Lillian sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the scholarship folder she had brought with her in the rush to leave. The storm outside had calmed, but the storm within her raged on. Suddenly the room phone rang, startling all three of them. Miss Lillian answered hesitantly, her voice cautious. "Hello?" It was Mr. Kane. "Mrs. Johnson, I just got off the phone with Mr. Wilson. He wants to meet with you and Amara tomorrow. He has something important to discuss." Miss Lillian's grip on the phone tightened. "What is this about?" "You will have to hear it from him," Mr. Kane said simply. "I'll pick you up in the morning." Miss Lillian hung up, her face unreadable. Amara looked at her, a question in her eyes, but her mother simply shook her head. "Get some rest, Amara. she said quietly. "We'll figure this out tomorrow." The morning came too quickly, bringing with it a mix of anticipation and unease. Amara and her family had slept fitfully in the unfamiliar comfort of the hotel room. Miss Lillian stood by the window, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee as she stared at the quiet street below. Amara sat cross-legged on the bed, flipping through a book she had borrowed from school, though her eyes barely skimmed the words. "Ma," she said softly, breaking the silence, "what do you think Mr. Wilson wants to talk about?" Miss Lillian sighed, setting her coffee cup on the small table by the window. "I don't know, baby, but we'll find out soon enough." The knock at the door came just as Amara was tying her sneakers. Mr. Kane stood in the hallway, dressed as impeccably as ever, his expression polite but unreadable. "Ready?" he asked. Miss Lillian nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. She grabbed her coat, and the three of them followed Mr. Kane down to the waiting black car. The car ride was quiet, the tension palpable. Amara stared out the window, watching the city pass by. When the car pulled up to a modest but well-kept house on the outskirts of town, her curiosity deepened. Mr. Kane led them to the front door and knocked twice before stepping back. The door opened to reveal Mr. Wilson, his frail frame leaning on a polished wooden cane. Despite his physical frailty, his smile was warm and genuine. Come in," he said, stepping aside to let them in. His voice was soft, but carried a quiet strength. The inside of the house was simple but inviting, with well-worn furniture and photos lining the walls. Amara noticed several pictures of Mr. Wilson as a younger man, smiling with his family, standing in front of a factory, and even shaking hands with someone who looked important. "Please have a seat," Mr. Wilson said, gesturing to the couch. The Johnsons sat together, their posture stiff. Mr. Kane stood near the doorway, observing quietly. "I wanted to thank you again, Amara," Mr. Wilson began, his eyes meeting hers. "What you did for me that day, it might not seem like much to you, but it reminded me of something I'd nearly forgotten, that there's still kindness in the world." Amara shifted in her seat, unsure how to respond. "I just didn't want you to get hurt," she said softly. Mr. Wilson smiled, leaning forward slightly. "That's exactly my point. You didn't have to help me, but you did. And that says a lot about who you are." Mr. Wilson's expression grew more serious as he turned to Miss Lillian. "I know life hasn't been easy for you. I've been where you are, struggling to make ends meet, trying to give my family a better future. But I was fortunate enough to have someone step in and help me when I needed it most. Now, I want to do the same for you." Miss Lillian opened her mouth to protest, but Mr. Wilson held up a hand. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a chance for Amara to thrive, to become everything she's meant to be. That scholarship, it's not just a piece of paper. It's a doorway to opportunities that can change her life." Amara's heart raced as she looked at her mother. She could see the hesitation in Miss Lillian's eyes, the internal struggle between pride and the desire to give her children a better future. "What if we accept, and it doesn't work out?" Miss Lillian asked, her voice trembling. "What if it comes with conditions we can't meet?" Mr. Wilson leaned back, his hands resting on the head of his cane. "The only condition is that Amara gives it her best effort, and if she struggles, she'll have support. No one expects her, or any of you, to be perfect. We just want to give her a chance." The room fell silent as Miss Lillian processed his words. Finally, she turned to Amara, her eyes filled with both love and worry. "What do you want, baby?" she asked gently. Amara hesitated, her thoughts swirling. She thought about her cramped school, the whispers from classmates and neighbors, and the weight her mother carried every day. But she also thought about the opportunity in front of her, the chance to prove that she could rise above it all. "I want to try, Ma," she said, her voice steady. "I want to show people that we're more than what they think. I want to make you proud." Tears filled Miss Lillian's eyes as she reached out to cup her daughter's face. "You already make me proud, Amara. Every single day." She turned back to Mr. Wilson, taking a deep breath. "We'll do it, but on one condition. If Amara ever feels like she's losing herself in all of this, we stop. No questions asked." Mr. Wilson nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Deal." The ride home was filled with a cautious optimism. Amara felt a new sense of purpose blooming inside her, but she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. When they arrived back in their neighborhood, it didn't take long for the news to spread. By the time Amara stepped out of the car, a small group of neighbors had gathered nearby, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. "Taking more handouts, huh?" one woman muttered. Amara's chest tightened, but she lifted her chin. She looked directly at the woman and said, "It's not a handout. It's a chance to make something better, for my family and for myself." The woman seemed taken aback by Amara's confidence, but she didn't respond. Slowly the group began to disperse, their whispers fading into the background. That night, as Amara lay in bed, she felt a sense of determination she hadn't felt before. The scholarship wasn't just a gift, it was a responsibility, and she was ready to prove that she was worthy of it. "I won't let this chance go to waste," she whispered to herself, staring up at the cracks in the ceiling. "For Ma, for Darius, for me." Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the streets quiet under a blanket of stars, and for the first time in a long time, Amara felt like her future was within reach. The air was crisp and cool as Amara stood on the front steps of her new school. The large red brick building loomed before her, its arched windows gleaming in the early morning sun. Students moved past her, chatting and laughing, their uniforms neat and pristine. Amara adjusted her own blazer nervously, her fingers brushing over the small scholarship pin on her lapel. "Deep breath, Amara," she whispered to herself. "You've got this." Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Walk in there with your head held high. You deserve to be there as much as anyone else." Amara squared her shoulders and stepped inside. The hallways were bustling, lined with bright posters advertising clubs, events, and sports teams. Amara clutched her schedule tightly, her heart pounding as she searched for her first classroom. She could feel the weight of curious eyes on her, some friendly, others less so. "Hey," a voice said, breaking her thoughts. Amara turned to see a girl about her age with curly red hair and a bright smile. "You're new, right? I'm Sarah. Need help finding your class?" Amara nodded, relieved. "Yeah, I'm looking for history. Room 202. Sarah glanced at her schedule and smiled. "You're with Mr. Callahan. He's tough, but fair. I'll show you the way." As they walked, Sarah chatted easily, pointing out landmarks and sharing tips about the school. Amara found herself relaxing, her initial nerves slowly fading. Over the next few weeks, Amara threw herself into her studies. The classes were challenging, but she was determined to prove herself. She spent late nights poring over textbooks, her notes spread out across the kitchen table. At first, some of her classmates doubted her. There were whispers about how she had gotten in and whether she could keep up. But as time went on, Amara's hard work began to speak for itself. She aced her first math test, earning a nod of approval from her stern teacher. Her history essay was chosen as an example for the class, and she even started tutoring a struggling student in English. One afternoon, as she walked through the courtyard, she overheard two students talking. "Amara's pretty smart, huh?" one of them said. "Yeah," the other replied. "Guess we were wrong about her." Amara smiled to herself, a flicker of pride warming her chest. True to the scholarship's requirements, Amara also began participating in community service projects. She joined a group that organized food drives and after-school programs for underprivileged kids. It was during one of these events that she had an idea. "What if we brought some of this back to my neighborhood?" she suggested during a meeting. "There are kids there who could really use this kind of help." The group leader, a kind-hearted woman named Mrs. Delaney, nodded thoughtfully. "That's a wonderful idea, Amara. Why don't you lead the project?" Amara's eyes widened. "Me? I don't know if I can." "Of course you can," Mrs. Delaney said with a smile. "You've got the passion and the drive. That's all you need." Encouraged by Mrs. Delaney's faith in her, Amara organized a weekend program in her old neighborhood. The turnout was better than she had hoped, with dozens of kids showing up for games, tutoring, and a warm meal. Seeing their smiles reminded her why she had fought so hard to take this opportunity. Word of Amara's efforts began to spread. Even Mr. Patel, who had once been one of her harshest critics, took notice. One afternoon, as she passed his store, he stepped outside to speak with her. "Amara," he called, his tone softer than she had ever heard it. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" She hesitated, then nodded. Sure. Mr. Patel rubbed the back of his neck, looking uncharacteristically sheepish. I owe you an apology. I judged you and your family unfairly. I see now that you're doing something good, not just for yourself, but for all of us. I'm sorry. Amara was stunned, but she managed a small smile. Thank you, Mr. Patel. That means a lot. He nodded, his expression earnest. Keep going, Amara. You're making us proud. Months turned into years, and before long, Amara stood on the stage at her high school graduation. The auditorium was packed with proud families and beaming students, their caps and gowns a sea of blue and gold. As the valedictorian, Amara had been chosen to give the closing speech. She gripped the edges of the podium tightly, her heart racing as she looked out at the crowd. In the front row, she saw her mother and Darius, their faces glowing with pride. Amara took a deep breath and began. When I started here, I felt like I didn't belong. But someone once told me that kindness can change everything, that small acts can ripple outward, touching lives in ways we can't always see. Today, I stand here because of those ripples, because someone believed in me and gave me a chance. And now, it's my turn to pass that kindness on. The room erupted into applause as Amara stepped back from the podium, tears brimming in her eyes. She glanced at her mother, who mouthed the words, I love you. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Amara stood outside her family's newly renovated apartment. The leaky roof and cracked walls were long gone, replaced by fresh paint and sturdy repairs. Darius stood beside her, holding her hand, his eyes wide with wonder. Do you think we'll always be okay now, Amara? He asked. She looked down at him, smiling. We're not just going to be okay, Darius. We're going to thrive. Behind them, Miss Lillian stepped out onto the porch, a contented smile on her face. Together they stood in the golden glow of the evening, a family stronger than ever. Amara looked out at the horizon, her heart full of hope. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She was ready for it. Thank you for joining me for this story. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay updated on the heartfelt stories I'm passionate about sharing. Your support means the world to me and motivates me to keep creating. I'm truly grateful to have you on this journey with me.